Now let's talk about one of the more famous and enduring institutions of the late Imperial era, really the second millennium AD. From about 1000 AD or so until 1905, when it was finally abolished, China was famous for its civil service examination system. Now, what can we learn from the civil service examination system? What larger themes in Chinese history does it represent? Surprisingly, we're going to find that there's a lot of things, actually. There's a lot of windows that it opens up into various aspects of Chinese gender relations, economic relations, political relations as well. So essentially what we're talking about first is the type of education that people in China will receive. And here we need to make an important distinction with gender. There are elite boys who are the sons of wealthy families or up-and-coming, almost wealthy, but not quite there, but you do have surplus income, maybe a modest landlord who's got some surplus income. What are you going to do with that after you've bought your wife, paid the bride price, after you have bought an ox? And after you've bought sufficient land where you can hire other people to work your land and you got some disposable income coming in, what do you do with that income? You educate your son, the eldest son first, and then any additional sons beyond that if your money can afford it. You first educate your son. Then you have your poor boys and you have your girls, all right? Boys who are the sons of poor families, this is the majority of the population, of course, are not going to receive an education. Education is not free. Okay? You're going to be a laborer working with your muscles, with your hands, out in the sun all your entire life. You're going to get tan, light skin, long fingernails will be the hallmark of people who have made it in life, because that means you labor with your mind, not with your hands. An important distinction that even Mencius talked about in the days of the Chinese philosophers. And then you have most girls, both elite girls and non-elite girls. Most girls are also going to be excluded from an education, although there's going to be a few exceptions, as we will touch upon in a moment. From an economic point of view, what is the rearing of an eldest son to take the exams? What does that represent? Essentially, you're removing that son from productive labor. For 20, 30 years, you're not going to have any chance of passing the exams until you're well into your 20s, probably your early 30s. Okay? So you're removing your son from productive labor and trying to harness or leverage or translate a humanities-based education into unimaginable economic capital if he is successful in passing the exams. The wealth that will accrue to your family through official salary and all the perks of an official government post and the ways that you can bring in additional streams of income will make your family wealthy and able to keep trying to enter sons into the examination system for at least 2 or 3 generations. All right, so it's sort of a lottery that is worth playing, although the chances are also like a lottery. The chances you're going to pass the exam, as we'll see in a moment, are also quite small. What did the civil service exam test? It tested, as I said, the humanities, something that you might be surprised at today, but it was mainly philosophy, it was poetry, and it was sort of the Confucian classics, the main texts from the Zhou dynasty, the classical philosophers. Here is a passage from the Analects, from Mencius. How can you apply this to government policy? So you can see there's a lot of subjectivity here, but it's essentially a humanities education. You're not being tested on how well do you know the legal code of the dynasty so that you know how to preside over court cases. All right, that's not at all what you're being tested on. You're going to get into power, and then you're going to have underlings, technical specialists, that's going to be seen as less prestigious form of education than you, who are going to help you understand all the little details. You are being trained to be a transcendent, superhuman Confucian official who has moral supremacy and understands how to view the right and wrong of everything, and the actual technical details that require training and expertise, engineering, mathematics, legal codes, that sort of stuff. That's left to the people who essentially don't pass the exams but have an education. They will be funneled into more of a technical-based education and serve as the much less prosperous secretaries who are going to work underneath you in your post in the provinces. Now, the economic counterpart, while we're talking about this for girls, was foot binding. which interestingly enough also emerges around this exact same era. 10th, 11th century AD is when we start seeing it. It seems like foot binding probably began with sort of traveling dance troupes that would perform in elite courts, and they started doing this, and it was adopted by aristocratic elites who thought it was very attractive, and they started emulating it, and then it percolates down to the rest of society. Most elite Chinese women would get their feet bound from a very young age. It was very painful. It's often referred to as surgery without a scalpel. You can go, look at photos of foot binding that still remained in the 20th century with the trappings taken off. You can see the foot. It's quite shocking, the images that you'll see. But when it was wrapped up into a tiny little, sort of 5-6 inch foot, it was seen as an erotic fetish for men. It was seen as something that you just did. If you were wealthy, if you were elite, your women should have their feet bound. And the elites could do it successfully. They could, successfully by that I mean they could start young, 4 or 5 years old, and they could immobilize their daughters for many years at a time and take them out of productive labor, just like you took your son out of productive labor so he could go study for the exams. If you really want to feel sorry, you can feel sorry for anyone who had foot binding, although oftentimes they themselves would not have seen it in the way that we see it today, and many of them willingly embraced it. Nevertheless, if you really want to feel sorry for the girls who have their feet bound, I would feel sorry for the lower classes, because the lower classes wanted to emulate what the upper classes did. They too tried to bind their daughters' feet, but those daughters had to go out and work still, walk around and move, and so they often would do it not fully successfully, halfway, and it would be even more painful to have half-bound feet and still have to engage in productive labor. Some elite girls would get an education. It would be a limited education that emphasized poetry. Most women, if you were allowed to be educated, if your parents were so wealthy that they could educate all the sons and they still had extra resources, they bound your feet, well, we can now let our daughter get educated. That's fine. There's no harm necessarily if the education is right. It needs to be the right education. And so poetry was seen as something that could get them some transcendent ideas about civilization and proper behavior and human relationships without getting them into politics, because women aren't supposed to get into politics. So education, chiefly in reading and writing poetry. By and large, if you were going to get an education and you were a woman, that's what it was going to be. Now back to the examination system. The Chinese civil service examination system was by far the earliest systematized, standardized mechanism of anonymous bureaucratic recruitment in the entire world. You see nothing similar to this whatsoever in any state, anywhere in the world, until you have the British Raj in India, a colonial administration training British civil servants to go out to India and work for the Raj in the 19th century. I think it's 1830s, 1840s, they come up with their own standardized examination system, which is supposed to be, represent anonymous bureaucratic recruitment. That's not till the 19th century. So the Chinese are way beyond the rest of the world and saying, hey, we've got a massive centralized administration that has acute need of talented bureaucrats who all have a similar education, and we can trust that there's a certification system involved here. Where the emperor, remember Han Feizi and legalism, the emperor can't possibly know everyone or uses charisma to influence them. We need to make sure they've gone through the same system. A standardized method of anonymous bureaucratic recruitment. Now, it never entirely lived up to the meritocratic ideal. There were always loopholes. There was always favoritism. Sometimes there was cheating. Sometimes the people who were grading the exams could know the identities. But hey, there's always shortcomings to these sorts of things. By and large, it did a pretty impressive job, considering nowhere else in the world is even trying to have a system of bureaucratic recruitment like this whatsoever. At its height, during the Song Dynasty is 960 AD to 1268 when the Mongols conquered them finally, up to 50% of government posts may have been filled by the anonymous examination system. Now, depending on the dynasty that's in power, whether it's a northern hybrid state in which nomads are at the top, whether it's a southern agricultural state, mostly culturally Chinese, the remaining 50%, or maybe even 75%, depending on how much they're using the exam. Sometimes the Mongols, for a brief period, abolished the examination entirely, then brought it back. The rest of the bureaucratic posts would be filled by aristocratic connections. the aristocracy, the ruling clan. You know, they multiply like rabbits. There's princes to the nth degree. All of their kids, very quickly, you need posts for these people. So they get a lot of jobs. That's pretty much hereditary connections. Eunuchs, if you're a southern agricultural state, originally based in the south, oftentimes you'll employ a lot of eunuchs as a counterpart to the civil service examination graduates. You'll think that eunuchs are more reliable. It's sort of a backdoor channel where the emperor can have people who are totally loyal to him and don't have a separate base of power that is connected to their own family's wealth and education and everything. So eunuchs are very attractive for southern agricultural dynasties. The nomads in their dynasties, the Mongol Yuan dynasty, the Manchu Qing dynasty, will often have some sort of affirmative action program in place for themselves to make sure that, oh, if you're a Manchu, you're going to be able to take an easier version of the exam, or you might not have to take the exam at all. So there'll be all these different types of systems. There'll be a shadow recommendation system sometimes where officials can recommend someone that'll increase their chance of an exam at a later stage being selected as well. So there are other methods, but nevertheless, up to 50% of government posts could be filled by an anonymous exam system that ostensibly was based on a meritocracy, your mastery of the humanities. Even though anyone who's ever graded papers understands that there is a great deal of subjectivity involved in grading the quality of one essay over another. And if push comes to shove, sometimes it is difficult to point exactly why this one got an A and that one got a B. There were 3 levels to the civil service examination system, 3 main levels. There's other intermediate details as well, but we'll keep this simple. At the county, at the province, and then finally at the imperial capital. At each stage, you've got a pass rate of between 1 to 7%. Okay, that's pretty small at each stage. All right, so of course there's a lot of luck involved. The analogy with the lottery system is, I think, actually fairly on the mark. A lot of subjective luck involved, whether or not your essay is going to be chosen, because it is essentially writing an essay. The final round, if you pass the final round in the imperial capital, you were known as a jinshi. A jinshi literally means a scholar who is presented. Presented to who? Presented to the emperor. Because the emperor wanted to meet everyone who passed and became a jinshi, because these were the people who had usually an automatic right to be appointed to an official magistrate's post in the counties. There's about 2,000 of these in the largest dynasties. And so the emperor wanted to make sure he had a personal meeting with them. All right, now, how do we conceptualize this personal meeting, this audience with the emperor for jinshi graduates who are about to go into the provinces to take up their posts? Well, remember, this is a certification system, sort of think back to Hanfeizi and the legalists here, to ensure standardized talent and intelligent people who get into the government, who nonetheless have a token subservience to the emperor before being sent out into the provinces. This is sort of, it's been described as an intimidation meeting, where the emperor reminds them, yes, you're smart, yes, you're brilliant, yes, your family connections allowed you to have the education to do this, yes, you have another base of power outside of my control, usually in the south, but make sure you understand, I have the arbitrary power of a despot, and if you misstep, if you try to challenge my authority when you're outside of the capital in the provinces, I have means to rein you in. All right? So that's sort of what this audience with the emperor is. Now, all the jinshi graduates, they go out and they are considered to be generalists. Their mastery of the humanities has given them a moral transcendence and moral supremacy to be able to manage a staff of technical experts. Some of them may become very technically sophisticated themselves, but that's not what they take pride in. They are also rotated around on what is known as the law of avoidance. The law of avoidance, hui bi in Chinese. The idea that the emperor is always worrying that this independent base of power, these people who have passed the exams, come from wealthy, powerful families, usually in the south, usually the Yangtze River area. Remember the Great Southern Migration? That's where all the money, the academies, the libraries, the cultural sophistication, the wealthy landlords, they're all down there in the south now, even though military power is in the north. So he rotates them around, the law of avoidance. They can never be posted to their home province. They can't even be posted within a certain number of miles of the border to their home province. Let's say if they're in an adjacent province, because they're afraid, the emperor's afraid they're gonna collude with their family members back home or other bases of support. This is a reminder of the emperor's suspicion of his officials, people who are not related to the imperial family, although he's also suspicious of those as well. What a life, right? You have to suspect everyone. And this enduring tension between you need a qualified pool of talent to run this empire. You can't count on the charisma of the emperor or personal ties anymore. The empire has been way too big for over 1,000 years by this point. And yet they also have significant autonomy from him. This is why there'll also be quotas for each province. The provinces that are in the Yangtze River Delta area will have quotas. Only a certain number of examination graduates can go on to the next stage from this province. And so sometimes the wealthy families would try to get around that. If anyone had ever been posted to another province, they'd make sure their son sort of registered in that province and took the exam in a much poorer province in which there wasn't as much competition among the gentry. So there were all these little mechanisms that remind us of the tensions involved in running this massive empire. It's not one big happy family. It's difficult to find the people you need to run this empire without the empire coming apart at the seams, because almost by definition, the people who have passed this exam come from wealthy families, usually far away from the imperial capital, and their interests could be at odds with the emperor himself. That's why he counterbalances their influence with eunuchs. That's why northern hybrid states will counterbalance their influence with Mongols and Manchus, who have sort of affirmative action to make sure that they monopolize a good percentage of government positions, top government posts, far out of proportion to their numbers. However, the takeaway point still stands that it's actually a remarkable institution for its time and place. The ideal of an anonymous bureaucratic recruitment based on merit. Didn't always live up to that ideal, but when it did, it was a pretty impressive institution that lasted for over 900 years until 1905. And it's pretty amazing how many different themes we can look at for late imperial Chinese history simply through the prism of the civil service examination system.